Hi folks, I hope this finds you doing well and staying safe and healthy. I want to show a demo, but it's going to be quite different from most of the previous demos, which have concentrated primarily on a feature or a set of enhancements. Instead, this is going to focus on a process and some of the best practices around that process. And specifically, it's going to be the process of taking an existing code base and bringing it into Illuminated Cloud and effectively creating a new baseline based on the way that the Illuminated Cloud works, its features, the base JetBrains IDE's features, static code analysis, to really prep it for ongoing development. I'm going to use a project here that is not one of my kind of curated demo projects. It's going to be just one of the Trailhead projects. And I'm going to have to put an index on the end because due to some flakiness in Salesforce, I've had a couple of kind of false starts on this. Hopefully this will be the one. So I'm just going to go ahead and put an index on the end here. It's going to clone the project and it's going to ask if I trust it. I do. And it's going to open it in the IDE. And while the project was brought in successfully, you can see the directory structure on the left. It's not completely ready for use with Illuminated Cloud. If you've used Illuminated Cloud in the past, you're probably familiar with most of these little toaster pop-ups here, in particular this one. This is one we're going to focus on for the moment, which is Illuminated Cloud effectively saying, things are not quite primed for me to be able to use this. Let me help you with that. So we'll click Resolve, and it'll begin to kind of walk us through some of it. So conversion of the module type. And then the next thing it'll need to do is well, actually, there will be several. Let's just take a look at what it prompts us with here in just a moment. So we'll go ahead and say resolve again. So the next aspect will be setting up the directories, tagging the directories where interesting content is. So content roots are places where the project directories where the project has files that are interesting from the perspective of the project. And those have source roots, which begin to categorize those files as source files or test source files or resource files. Excluded directories that should not be included, that should not be used for indexing or for project level search. It will derive this heuristically, but in this case, it begins by looking at the package directories in sfdx project.json. You could configure these manually if you didn't like what Illuminated Cloud selected now or at any time later, but these look good. I'm going to go ahead and take them. Now we need to connect this up with an actual organization. Now we could choose an existing connected organization, but a brand new project checked out of version control. I want to go ahead and create a Scratch org and have really just a completely isolated environment to work with this project. So I'm going to use my default dev hub. I have multiple dev hubs, and rather than populate this myself, I'm going to load the Scratch def that was actually checked out with the project that really describes the org shape that should be used. I'm going to use the same kind of an index here, and we're going to say OK. Now, one thing I want to point out, excuse me, is that there are going to be a couple of potentially long-running steps depending upon how the Salesforce queues are behaving and things like that. Scratch org creation will be one. The initial push to the org will be another. There may be others. On those, you may see me do like a speed up or a transition in the video, just so I'm not wasting your time. But this should be one end-to-end process. That's the plan, is that the demo is one end-to-end process from where I started to the final state where we kind of review the process I went through and what came of it. Okay, wonderful. That actually went, excuse me, my voice is also going to be a challenge here because of the beginning of pollen season here. But that actually went quite quickly. So we'll go ahead and accept that as the Scratch org for this project. And it's going to set the default username so you can run the CLI from the command line within the directory structure of this project and have it not require a -u or --= username in order to designate who you are. And now we will move on to the next steps in, like I said, effectively bootstrapping this project into the IDE. So the next step would generally be generation of the offline symbol table, the SDK that's specific to the connected organization. Because Illuminated Cloud sees that we have a brand new organization, has a very recent created date, and we have local metadata files, it would be best to populate the organization before generating the offline symbol table, because the OST reflects the populated state of the organization as well as its shape. So we're going to go ahead and begin a push to the organization now. Again, this is one of those long running operations, so you may see a fast forward at this point. Okay, the push is complete successfully, and now it will generate that high fidelity org specific SDK for us. And as soon as that finishes, we can close and reopen the project. One thing I'll point out while that's happening is sometimes there are additional steps that need to occur after the org has been created, after you've pushed the org. For example, these steps here, you can always go and do those very easily by just opening a terminal. And so we'll just go ahead and copy a step here and paste it in here and let it run. So I'm not going to do all these steps, but just showing that if you needed to do those from the effectively from the environment of the IDE, it's very easy to go and do those without having to open another tool or anything. You can just open a terminal from right here within the IDE and very easily copy paste down. Okay, so the offline symbol table is generated. It's about to pop up and tell us that it's mounted it onto the project. And yeah, and so now we can go ahead and close and reopen the project. Obviously, it has to index that SDK, and we can close this terminal window. We're no longer going to use that. So once it closes and reopens, we should be in very close to a whole state. Now, that doesn't mean that we're done. We'll look at what our next steps are. But minimally, we have the metadata. We have an organization for that metadata. The project will be in a basically fully configured state. We will have an offline symbol table mounted to the project so that we actually have an SDK for Salesforce development against that organization. There are a few other things we'll want to do just to put things into ship shape though. So let's see what the validator shows us now that it's come up. So one thing is, and we'll do this in just a moment, in fact, I'll go ahead and do it, is run npm install. The project has a package.json, and that includes, and that's going to be the case with really any SFDX project you create. And it's going to include the dependencies for Lightning Web Components development, Jest testing against those. If you are doing Salesforce functions development, it may include entries for Salesforce functions. So you want to go ahead and get those set up. This only applies if you're using a commercial JetBrains IDE, by the way. If you're using a community edition IDE, it doesn't really have a first-class notion of JavaScript and TypeScript as languages, ES6 as a dialect of those languages or of JavaScript. It doesn't really understand Node Package Manager, but since I'm using IntelliJ IDEA Ultimate Edition, it immediately recognized that and is prompting me to make everything whole here with regard to the JavaScript and TypeScript libraries. But the other thing that came up, going back over to notifications, so npm install just finished, is it's saying there are a couple of additional excludes. So the working directories for the CLI for the project. So I'm going to go ahead and add those as exclusions to the project so that we don't have indexing against those. Those aren't included in search. Things that land under there can sometimes create ambiguities with project files, things like that. So at this point, we should have things in a relatively whole state. Let's take a look at our version control. I'm going to go ahead and organize things by directory, and we'll pull this up a little bit so we can get a better look. So packagelock.json was just updated by virtue of running npm install. It has effectively said that the IDE project files should be added to version control. This is really up to you, but I recommend if you're working against version control, you go ahead and do this. It's going to, the JetBrains IDE is going to automatically create a git ignore that excludes the files that should never be checked in because they are user specific and should not be shared across users on a team. So you could go ahead and just add these to version control, and that way you have the team's preferences for how the project should work and be configured available in version control. It makes onboarding new people, creating projects against a particular code base very, very simple. Now, the other one that's been added is the offline symbol table. There's been an open question from people about should you check this in or not. The answer is it depends. I talk about this in more detail in the frequently asked questions on the website. I generally don't because I generally work against projects where offline symbol table generation is a matter of like a minute. If you're working against an organization where it takes 10 minutes to generate your OST because it's such a densely populated org, I've only heard about a few of those. But if that's the case, you may you may want to check yours in. But if you don't want to, then you can very easily go here to Git and say add to git ignore. And you can see it's been removed from the list of files even available to be checked in. And we'll just go down here and put a little IC2 qualifier here. And now you can see it's also saying there's some things in this .getIgnore that are not considered excludes in the project. So let's add parity there. And now those are actually going to be excluded. And let's see where that leaves us. Okay, so that pretty much leaves us with the beginning of a solid version controlled IC2 project on top of this. So why don't we go ahead and create a branch that we could use to create a pull request back to main and call it IC2. And I'm going to go ahead and check these files into the branch, and we'll just call this IC2 initial configuration. I'm going to go ahead and turn off some of these additional options. You may or may not want them on, but I'm going to go ahead and turn them off for this commit. And so now we have our initial baseline. So the next thing we might want to do is kind of a quality assessment. Perhaps go make sure everything deployed to the org properly. We know that it did, but that things are working how we want, and run all of our unit tests. And we have kind of two classes of unit tests. We have Apex unit tests and Jest unit tests for our Lightning Web Components. So we can very quickly run all Apex unit tests by right-clicking on the project node and saying run all tests. I can even run different options. So I'm going to say run all tests with coverage. And that's going to create, if it doesn't already exist, an all tests run config. And so we can see them running. We can go up and we can take a look at that run config under edit configurations, and we can see it's an all test with the name all tests against our Scratch org. We can store this as a project file so that it can be checked into version control and shared with our team. Probably everybody wants this. And then we can do the same thing for Jest. Now I can't right click the way that I did. I can't have that contextual creation of it, but right here I can say add Jest. Now I'm going to give it a unique name because we called our Apex one all tests. So I'll Jest tests, and store that as a project file. And you can see there's one more error down here, unspecified Jest package. So we'll just go over here and choose the Jest package that was brought into the project, into the node modules by virtue of us running npm install. And we can go ahead and say okay. Tests are still running there. They'll complete in just a moment, but we can see that we now have two new files that we might add to version control. So we'll go ahead and do that. Those are our shared run configs. And now we can also see that all the tests completed. We have about 94% code coverage, so that's pretty darn solid. If we want to, look at various classes, we can see specifics about the code coverage. Red, I think everybody knows this. Red means uncovered. Green means covered. All that kind of stuff. Let's go run our Jest tests as well. We'll go ahead and run those with coverage as well, and make sure that they're all passing correctly. And that will establish a further baseline that we would want to share with our team. And then we'll move on to the next phase, which is static code analysis. All right, so the tests are done. And we have 74%, not quite as good, but not bad, coverage. And so we can go ahead and close that up. So all of our tests went through just fine. We'll go ahead and check this in. Added unit test, run configs. Turn off get hooks because we're not planning on actually working against the origin. And okay, and that's in. So how do we use static code analysis to figure out if we have any issues or inefficiencies or maybe violations of best practices? Well, we'll go to code and say inspect code, and go ahead and run it for the whole project. And Illuminated Cloud actually includes an out-of-the-box inspection profile that includes rules for all the languages used for Salesforce development, not just Apex, but JavaScript, TypeScript, CSS, Markdown, you pretty much name it. So rather than use the one from the IDE, why don't we say configure, and let's copy it to the project so we can specialize it. So we can still call it Illuminated Cloud, that's fine. And then one other thing that we can do real quick is we can turn on the integrated PMD integration. So it's already on, and it's already found PMD via environment variable, the distribution. I recommend that you use an environment variable. And what I mean by that is add the PMD distribution path /bin directory to your operating system's execution path, the $path environment variable. If you add that, it'll automatically pick that up, and that won't be in the resulting file that gets checked into version control because this is not a path under the project. And then I believe this project has a rule set. Yeah, it has its own rule set from version control, probably something you want to check in. So we'll go ahead and say okay. And now we have a project-specific inspection profile, and we'll go ahead and run that. And it'll start showing, excuse me, the violations that it finds pretty much in real time as it passes over the project. And what we're going to do is we're going to make a couple of passes here. The first pass is going to be just looking at errors. If it finds any errors, we're going to address those first. And then we're going to circle back around and look at warnings and see if any of these warnings are ones that we actually want to address. Now, the number is going to be pretty high here in the end. We'll talk about what that means. We're not going to look at every single thing. In fact, we're going to look at a very small subset of it, and then I'll provide some directional guidance on what you do with the rest of the information that actually comes out of this. But we can see here that it's already found some errors with the Salesforce metadata, which primarily is going to be Apex. And I believe it's also going to find a few other errors in XML, in Markdown. Let's see what it finds when everything's said and done. All right, so that's done, and it definitely found some errors. So let's just take a look. We'll go to General first and look at syntax errors here, and these are all in Markdown files. Let's take a look at what they are, and they're all going to be pretty much the same. So I'm going to go ahead and just open this in the editor, and then we'll go back over. And so it's effectively saying that this is invalid. So we've told in Markdown for this code block, we've said it's Java, and it makes sense why that happened, because Apex is not really a language well understood by most Markdown processors. Java is, and the Apex syntax is most similar to Java in terms of supported languages. But the problem is in the IDE, JetBrains IDEs will actually go ahead and use their first class native support for whatever the language here is, as long as it exists, and this is not Java. So there are a couple of ways we could address this. One of them is, you can see the first class supported languages here, is we could change this to Apex, and not only do we get better syntax highlighting, the errors go away, and it's actually evaluating this. You can see references highlighting and things like that. And it's actually evaluating this truly as Apex. But as I said, not all Markdown processors support that. So that may not be the answer to what you want. Another thing you can do is use contextual actions, Alt-Enter on Windows or Linux, Opt-Enter on Mac. That's going to be something we're going to use as we go through this, and you can see what other options are available. And one of them is just don't show errors in these code blocks. So let's just go ahead and do that, and we'll see that all of that general category of errors has gone away. All right, so let's open problems again and keep marching down. So that would actually take care of all of these. Or at least most of them. So let's go back down here to where the Apex errors are, and it says they're unresolvable references. So what are these? Well, basically, the org that we created, Scratch org we created, does not have multi-currency enabled, but there is logic inside of the code that can work conditionally based on whether it's a multi-currency enabled org. The problem is that with multi-currency not enabled in the org, the offline symbol table reflects such an org, and the dated conversion rate object, test object, just simply doesn't exist. So again, we can actually address this either by creating a new Scratch org that has multi-currency enabled, or if we want to play kind of a least common denominator perspective here, we can bring up the context options, move to the right to see what other options we have, and we can suppress this with a comment saying, basically, don't report unresolvable references here. And we have really the same issue here, and so we'll do the exact same thing. So that problem effectively goes away. And the last one that we have is down here in XML, and it's saying wrong tag value. And XML is a case-sensitive language. The XSD provided by Salesforce for these documents specifies that the value for the is_exposed element must be true or false, all lowercase. And here it's obviously capitalized. So that's easily fixed. Obviously, the server accepts the values in a case-insensitive manner, but again, an XML validator based upon an XSD is not going to do that. So that takes care of those issues. Let's go ahead and let this run again and see where that leaves us. That should eliminate a swath of them, and then we're assuming there are no errors, we'll come back and take a look at the resulting warnings. And subsequent runs of this tend to be quite a bit quicker, because the very first run is visiting all the files for the very first time, and there are caches that are built out as that happens, and they're intelligent caches such that portions are only evicted if that particular portion of that file was modified. So it should go quite a bit quicker in terms of getting more insights into this on a subsequent pass. All right, so that completed. No errors this time, as we thought. Again, I'm not going to go through everything in detail, but you can see that if you wanted to go in and look at these, what I'd recommend is you either act upon reported issues or you disable that portion of the code inspection or configure it to your taste to dial in the signal to noise ratio. Moving on past CSS, we're not going to do anything with that. Let's look at this thing called annotator. So this is going to be some of these things that really operate once you go into a file. So you can see up here, it's now saying, okay, we have an issue here, and you can even see it reflected right here, where it said that the Jest describe function is unknown. And so the reason is the project, the Jest dependencies were added through NPM, but not added to the project here. So IC will guide you through exactly what it is you need to do. And then you just go and do exactly that. It can't do this for you, unfortunately. It's just not allowed by the IDE to go and add those dependencies automatically. But once those are in place, that will go away. So this general category of issues will go away. Duplicate code fragment. You really will need to decide what you want to do with this. It could be disabling it. It could be tuning it for the size of a block that's considered a duplicate code fragment in the various languages. Really up to you to get those resolved. Lots of things you might want to do in HTML, many in JavaScript. We're not going to deal with those right now. In Markdown, but why don't proofreading's an interesting one because it really is a spell checker and grammar checker. And many of the things you find in here are not actually misspellings. In this case, you would save those to the dictionary and check in the shared dictionary. And then if you see real misspellings, then there's a quick fix to actually change it to the correct word. Regular expression as a language, it'll find those. But let's go to Salesforce. This will be kind of our last place. So it's finding some issues here, for example, using test visible, the test visible annotation on something with public visibility, which is effectively extraneous, superfluous. If something's already visible, you don't need to make it visible to test the annotation. So we'll go ahead and just take care of some of these. You can actually act on these quick fixes right here. So we'll just remove the annotation. And then we now have this remaining where it says, let's see, same thing. And then Apex doc validation will get us to the next category. These are generally going to be things like this. We have documented something, a param as being accounts. We haven't documented the meaning of that. And the whole point of Apex doc and its analogs in other languages is to document your APIs. So if that's missing, it needs to be filled in. So really, this is going to be up to you visiting these types of things and how you want to address them. Control flow analysis. Most of these are going to be based on the recent enhancement to look for opportunities for immutability. There will be one exception to this in this case, but most of these are going to be based on that. Basically, it's found fields and variables, and actually fields specifically that are assigned exactly once and assigned in a valid context, like a constructor context or something like that. And after that can be final. And you can treat those properly as immutable data. So why don't we go ahead and do that? We'll take that fix. And there's only going to be one thing left here, down here, test double, one warning. And it's saying that continue is unnecessary in this loop because there's no logic that would come after it, so the loop would automatically continue. So the quick fix is going to be to remove the continue statement, but really that leaves us still in kind of a strange state where we have an empty code block. So why don't we just say, do a Boolean negation of this logic and remove the else block, and we should have the same logic, right? All right, we'll find out in just a moment. All right, so control flow analysis is done. Field can be made static. We have what are effectively class constants that are set to final, but not set to static and are treated as class constants. So those can be made static. So we'll go ahead and do that. Methods that can be made static. Excuse me. So we can do the exact same thing. This is going to be an example of keywords not using the preferred case. Now you can configure the preferred case however you want, or at least within reason, but it's effectively saying there's not consistency here and it doesn't match the configured standard. So we can go ahead and say change all keywords to match the configured preferred case. Generally, you'd want to go into the formatter and actually decide what that is. But in this case, let's just say for a moment that I'd already configured the formatter. That's going to take care of that. Unused declarations. On this one, you really want to go visit each one and say, is it truly unused in dead code, in which case you can remove it? Is it just not detected, are there usages that aren't detected by IC, which honestly, please open a bug or contact me about that, because IC should be filtering all of those out. If there are use cases I don't know about, I'd like to know about them. Or is it something that's not used now but will be in the future, in which case you could potentially suppress it temporarily. But you don't want to just go and do like remove unused declarations. It could very well break your code. And then similar to keyword doesn't use preferred case, usage case doesn't use declaration case. So the class called integer is capital I. It is. Apex is a case-insensitive language, but there is a canonical representation of every declaration's name, and that is its name at the point of declaration. And if usages don't match that, they're effectively incorrect. So what we'll do is just go ahead and fix all of these. All right, let's run again and see where that leaves us. And then we're going to go ahead and push and make sure that everything saves, because otherwise we've broken code. And then we're going to run unit tests. Okay, so that pass is done. And even though it may look like there's still a lot up here, you can see that general has gone to 2 weak warnings. The things that we actually spent some time on. Markdown, it's really just incorrect table formatting. Salesforce, 225 warnings, and really they're in 3 categories. And we really want them down to just the 2 that we said you would go and address. Let's see what's going on with code flow analysis. So this is one of the lines that was changed. We can see that right here by comparing it to the last version in version control where we added final, but it's telling us something else. It's saying that these variables might not have been initialized. And so that would prompt me to start looking around with what's going on. Where would these be initialized? And when I look at the actual class comment here, it's saying that these are going to be used in JSON deserialization. Now, IC has no way of seeing those used in JSON deserialization, but if that's the case, these can't be final. So let's go ahead and turn that off. But the problem is we're now still left with a warning. So why don't we suppress those? So we could suppress those for the fields, but since this entire class is going to be deserializable, we can actually do it for the class. So we can do that right there, and that goes away. And I think that puts us in good shape. That was the only one that was kind of outstanding. If we go and run this one more time, we should only have those 2 categories left. So I think we have things the way that we want. So if we go back into version control, we can obviously see that we have quite a few changes. We've got our inspection profile and the libraries added, and where we turned off showing problems in code blocks on Markdown. And then we have a bunch of source files, and we can see here, by the way I've configured this to get a good signal noise ratio is I've put it side-by-side viewer, ignore white space and empty line changes, and turn on effectively contextual diffs so that you see only a few lines around the actual portions that have changed. You don't have to actually wander through the entire file. Again, whatever you want to do is up to you. That just works well for me. And we can see things like this is changing keywords to match preference. This is adding final and static, and keywords change to match preference. Keywords, if we go down identifier names, things like that. So why don't we go ahead and start a push? All right, so we're pushing now. Again, this could be a long-running operation, and so probably fast forward. All right, so the push was complete successfully. So that means that all those automated changes that we made, they didn't break our code, at least from a compilation standpoint. So then the next thing that we can do, since everything that was changed was effectively in Apex, is we can go and run all of our Apex tests again. And if all the tests pass, then we know that not only did we not break things from a compilation standpoint, we didn't break things from a behavioral or a meaning standpoint, and we've applied some best practices to our code base via insights gained through static code analysis. Okay, all the tests passed. So should be in pretty good shape. So why don't we create a new branch? Let's say that we, for the purposes of this kind of pretend discussion of how we're doing iterative improvements, why don't we say that we already did a pull request on the project config files. So we would have a new branch based on that. We'll just call that static code analysis fixes. And we'll go ahead and say fixes slash improvements based on static code analysis. And we'll go ahead and turn that off and check that in. And of course, as we go to do our pull request, or even before we do our pull request, go to just understand what it is we're going to be doing, we could go ahead and show a diff with that branch. You can see how things are gray here. That means they don't exist. So we want to actually change the order because I want it to be the base branch, in this case main, on the left, and I want it to be the feature branch on the right, static code analysis fixes. And so now we can see that relative to main, we've added all the IDE files. We've got, and I'm going to go ahead and just use, again, a very similar type of diff here. We can kind of go through. We can see that the types of changes that we've made here are exactly what we expected based on what we just went through. And so you could go and do kind of a review there and make sure things are good to go. So that's it. That's really what I wanted to show. A lot to it. If you've stayed to the end, I appreciate your patience and diligence, and hopefully you've learned something. Hopefully you've gained something out of this. But that's the kind of process that I would definitely recommend following to create a baseline for your projects as you bring them into Illuminated Cloud. The one thing I didn't go into because it's more trial and error is setting up your code style to match your existing code. And you just kind of have to go in and tweak it as close as possible, reformat, look for any discrepancies, tweak whatever that option is, look for any discrepancies, and you'll get it dialed in. I've even considered in the future having a way to infer a code style from an existing code base, but there are some complexities to that, especially since it's not just Apex, but you'd have to do that really for all the other languages as well: JavaScript, TypeScript, XML, JSON, Markdown, all these things that are used in Illuminated Cloud and Salesforce development. But the point is it's a good way to get a baseline for your code when you bring it into Illuminated Cloud and the JetBrains IDEs. It doesn't interfere with anyone else on your team that's using other tools because everything effectively is kind of independent. And I think it results in a better starting point for ongoing development because all those code inspections, all that static code analysis, those types of things are all going to be working on really a real-time basis from then on to help keep things in bounds. If you have any thoughts on other things that you normally do or would, it makes sense to do that could be automated better during this kind of bootstrapping process, let me know. I'd love to hear about them. I'm very passionate about this type of thing, about making it as efficient and complete as possible and pleasant as possible. If you find any bugs with it, file them in the public issue tracker. Otherwise, thank you very much for your time. And again, take care.